Hello, good evening. My name is Lisa Murray, and I am the Assistant Director and Program Coordinator for the MDI Historical Society. Thank you very much for coming here, and I'm really excited to be in this room. This is our first time here, and it's probably most of your first time here. So, like, what an asset to the community. I'm just thrilled that this is available to us. So, thank you very much for coming again. I want to thank the Jesup. This is just an amazing space, and they've been incredibly supportive of us, and I love presenting here. So they are partnering with us again this year with our Chubacco Author Series, which is a series of free public programs based on articles in our history journal Chubacco. If you're not familiar with it, we have some copies in the back. It comes out every year, and it draws from a wide variety of people and organizations. And we have a theme every year. Last year was nourishment. Next year's will be music. And this year we explored the ongoing process of democracy on MDI. We offer many public programs year-round on the island, usually at public libraries. And this coming Friday on June 27th at Hidden Barn Books in Bar Harbor, author Brooke Walensky-Lanford will discuss the role of religion in America and contemporary life. And she will also sign her newest book, A God-Shaped Nation, 500 Years of Religion in America. She's also the author of 2011's Paradise Lost, which was a big bestseller back then. And then on July 1st at Northeast Harbor Library, join us. We have Patrick, I will be there, and then Jen Heindel, who also works in our collections department, will be presenting Say What? MDI Lore in Tall Tales. It's an evening of myth busting and storytelling as we uncover the truth behind the island's most persistent legends. It's going to be really fun, and we hope a lot of people will show up and tell us some of the lore and the legends they've heard about MDI. I have an event flyer in the back. Feel free to grab one of those, or you can sign up for our email list and you'll get all of our upcoming programs that way. And if you enjoy this tonight's program, I encourage you to become members. Members support our public programming and support the publication of Chubacco. So thank you very much. Now, few figures in American history have fallen farther or more unfairly than Thomas Paine, the man who inspired support for the revolution with the American crisis and common sense, survived imprisonment during the French Reign of Terror, and penned some of the most consequential prose of the 18th century, died in 1809 with only 6 people at his funeral. Tonight, Dr. Patrick Callaway will take us inside that remarkable and troubled legacy. Dr. Callaway is collections manager at the MDI Historical Society, a frequent contributor and an editor of Chubacco, and is an assistant professor at the University of Maine at Presque Isle. So welcome, Patrick.
The other fun fact is that I haven't seen the top of my desk in several months. So there is that. So let me go ahead and get our show up and running. And there we go. So there are very few figures that we would speak of as the founding fathers of the nation that have a more strange and unusual career than Thomas Paine. Certainly we remember part of his legacy. And in a strange bit of happenstance, he is one of the founders that's actually better remembered for his words than his actual career in the States. So we're all familiar from school with the crisis and common sense and some of those real core writings of the constitutional era, leading to revolution, trying to explain why the revolution had to exist and where the revolution was going to go. However, he has a second part of his career. As we get into the 1780s and the 1790s, he finds himself involved in another revolution. This one perhaps a little bit less popular, and certainly less remembered in American history than perhaps it warrants. We will see a very significant change in how he is regarded because of this. His role in the American Revolution, part of our historical lore and memory as we look back 250 years. The second part of his career sees him devolve into infamy in the 1780s and 90s, leading to being almost forgotten in contemporary era. When we think of the 250th, for example, how many names do we go through before we land on Thomas Paine at all, or in any context other than his two pamphlets from 1776? Unlike Washington or Jefferson or Adams or so many others that we can name, he has virtually been erased from that history. The question that comes to us as historians is, why is that the case? So the man we're talking about is Thomas Paine, and this is an early portrait of him. He was born in England, so 1737, and had a varied career, running from being a tailor to a tax collector and a few other things in between. Things were not going so well for him. As we get to 1773 and 74, his creditors were quite persistent. He had been politically engaged in England at a time when being politically engaged in classically liberal ideas was not really associated with having a government job. As a tax collector, the expectation was that he would support the system as it existed. He would support the government, the parliament, the role of the crown. He would support the traditional structures of society. His pen perhaps ran ahead of his pocketbook in that, as a writer who questioned things like hierarchy, who critiqued the influence of special interests in Parliament, who had some very difficult things to say about the role of the crown in English society. Well, when you put those ideas front and center, when you put that in writing, at some point in time, your employer is going to notice that. So 1774, it's a good time for him to get out of town. He's facing debtor's prison, square in the face. Back in the day, if you owed people money and couldn't pay, they could throw you in prison. So he abandons his family and goes to America. So why? Well, he had some connections with Benjamin Franklin, who was an American and had operated as a colonial agent for several years. Through some of their mutual acquaintances, they were known to one another, and to all accounts, Franklin had taken a liking to Paine. He agreed with a lot of his ideas, and Franklin, not being an employee of the tax service, had a certain latitude to make his feelings known in a way that Paine just did not. Paine lands in Philadelphia in 1774, and if we stop here, this is a very classic sort of American story of somebody who has run into difficulties, somebody down on their luck who has come to the New World to try to recreate themselves, to build their estate, to reestablish themselves as part of the community. And it works. Possibly through the influence of Franklin, he finds himself work in the newspaper and magazine business. His writing, perhaps intemperate in English terms, was nonetheless very persuasive. Part of his appeal and part of his danger from the English eyes was that he could speak directly to the masses of people. So he was not an elite speaking to other elites. He was rather somebody who came from a middling background, speaking to other people who came from the same circumstances. So in English society, this would be a largely politically inactive or insignificant portion of the population. Politics at the time were very much driven by noble families and the upper class. That's what made him dangerous. In the colonies, that's what made him an appealing figure. So he starts to work in the newspaper business. To all accounts, he does very well. As we get into 1775, we know what happens. So we start to see the outbreak of revolution. So the United Colonies, all 13 of them, rising up against British rule. This had been coming. There had been tensions that had gone over the last several decades on how this came about. And they range everywhere from political representation, taxation policy, Western expansion policy. There was a number of practical and philosophical conflicts that a growing body of colonists had with the home country. Fighting breaks out in 1775, and this turns into a question. So what is the nature of this revolution going to be? What is it that we are trying to achieve as Americans? What are our goals? Well, that sounds like a pretty straightforward question to have as you're going into a revolution. But this is something that had not been distilled down to something that a popular audience could look at and understand and agree with the ideas of the revolutionaries more broadly. In January 1776, we have the publication of Common Sense. So this is where we mostly know Paine from. It's one of his two publications we're familiar with. And his goal in Common Sense was to explain to the American people why a revolution and why independence is a necessary outcome of that revolution. Remember, for the first year of the war, there was not a Declaration of Independence, and what the war goals were for the first year of the war were relatively uncertain. We get to January of 1776. This is published, and there is dispute on how many copies of it are published. Estimates range anywhere from 100,000 copies in the first 3 months, all the way to 500,000 through the course of the Revolution. There is dispute over those numbers. But the exact number really isn't the important part of our story. In the context of the time, a newspaper was financially solvent with about 250 to 300 subscribers. So anything into the thousands or tens of thousands would have been quite possibly one of the most widely spread publications in the entire country. So what did he say? Well, he laid out what the causes of dispute were. He pointed out the corruption of the British government, the unreasonable nature of a political body that has a king at its head that is not accountable to the people, of the corruption that we see in Parliament and the influence of large families, of wealth, of just elections that meant very little or nothing. He sees this as corruption. And America has a chance to rectify those wrongs and to build something better. So he doesn't go here, but sort of think of that idea of the Puritans and that city on a hill. In a political sense, this is what he is talking about. We can find a society that is rational, that is reasonable, that is democratic in a somewhat narrow sense of the word. We'll come back to that later. But the idea that the people had the right and the ability to establish their own government unrestrained by the customs and the corruptions that had been built up over time. So, well, when you put a revolution like that, that has a certain appeal to many people who perhaps said, well, this revolution isn't about me. I'm not interested in Western expansion, or I'm not interested in taxation issues. Those are things that are, those are other people's problems. If I'm a merchant, taxation matters. If I'm just a farmer in nobody cares, Pennsylvania, how does that affect me? Paine, through this pamphlet, is able to make the cause of the revolution understandable and appealing to the people at large. So this leads to the scene. So a very famous painting. This is the Declaration of Independence Committee presenting their findings to Congress. There is some talk, I'll say, of Paine having a hand in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. I've seen that story. I have not been able to see any sources that prove that directly. Certainly, Jefferson and the committee and Paine are trafficking in some of the same ideas. The idea that the people had the right and the duty to establish a government that was of the people and by representation without the corruptions that had creeped in. This also gives us a very specific type of revolution. Revolution in this context is not what we think of as a revolution in the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. We are not talking about a bottom-up revolution of people roaming across the countryside, of taking the law into their own hands, of violence and property destruction. Although the Revolutionary War does have some elements of civil war to it, yes, there is violence, yes, there is property destruction, the political revolution has a scene like this. So the respectable men of society, the upper class, putting forward a document laying out their grievances and expectations and moving on from there. So it is, at least in its intent, a much more narrow idea of revolution. This holds on to a great degree. If we look at the elites in late colonial society and the elites in early American Republican society, they are very, very similar groups of people, and many of them are the exact same people. So thinking of a Thomas Hancock, not Thomas, that's the father, John Hancock. Sorry, I do a lot of research in early Nova Scotia, and John's father, Thomas, has some nice journals I've been reading. Whoops. Oh well. Moving on. So figures like a Hancock or a Franklin or a Washington, people who had status, who had wealth at the beginning, tended to have status and wealth at the end. So this is an idea of almost a restoration, that the revolution is going to set things that had gone wrong in England to rights and establish something that worked in a much more functional and rational way. There's only one problem that comes with this, because this sounds like a great picture here. We have our document, we have a new country, everything's fine. That leads to one other problem. It's very easy to declare independence. It is much harder to win independence. Not everybody recognized the Declaration, and not surprisingly. The British government and George III really had no interest in the American colonies breaking away. They were going to reestablish the empire by force if necessary. Through 1776, they send out tens of thousands of troops from Britain to try to reconquer the colonies. Now, looking back from 250 years later, we know that this effort is not successful. But if we are a colonial person, a new American in July of 1776, this is a very dangerous moment. The British Army was the best in the world. It outnumbered the American Army in almost every theater of the war. They were supplied, they were fed, they had everything they needed to have as an 18th century weapon of war to bring the colonies back into obedience. The only thing standing between that victory for the British and American independence was the American people, the American army, the American militias. There's only a few problems that run with this. The lack of supplies, the lack of clothing, the lack of food, questionable leadership, political divisions that are already starting to appear. Looking back, we see this revolution as this great mass movement of everybody agreeing. John Adams himself, who has probably taken some liberties with our numbers, estimated that only a third of the American people actually supported the revolution. A third were neutral, and a third actively supported the British. So this is not the, no, we declared it so it is so type of political movement. Through the end of 1776, we see a number of British victories. So victories in battles around New York, victories throughout New England, taking a look at New York and the upper part of the state, taking a look at things like the chase across New Jersey, where the American Army perhaps does not go so well. Their battlefield conduct in fixed position does pretty well, but the British Army are the professionals. They can move across the landscape in ways that the Maine American Army doesn't match. The supply system starts to break down, the recruitment system starts to break down, and by the time we reach December of 1776, the revolution is in very, very dire straits. Washington's army, which numbered somewhere between 25 and 30,000 in July around New York, has been reduced to a couple of thousand, who just barely got across the Delaware to Pennsylvania by the very skin of their teeth. The revolution is hanging by a thread. There's more problems. The American Army had one-year enlistments. This was a measure that Congress had put in because of the fear of a standing army. So one-year enlistments, which happened to be up on December 31st. So we're sitting here, it's mid-December, the army is going to dissolve in the next couple of weeks. What do we do? Thomas Paine comes in to the rescue in part again. So this is the second of his most famous of American publications, The American Crisis. Now, he does not sugarcoat the issues. There's no way to lie on this and say that the war is going well. But what he does come out and say, no, these are the times that try men's souls. We're very familiar with that text. If you're reading this, it says fowls, long S. 18th century writing, unless it's the last S, it's spelled with an F. So fowls is actually souls. Not weird till you start doing it unintentionally. So he is putting forward a very case that says, no, yes, we are in bad shape, but this is the point in time when true American patriots are going to stand up. People who support the new government, who support the ideas of the new government. This is that moment in time when they have to stand up and be counted, not just in an intellectual sense, but through service. He's speaking very directly to those people who are discouraged, but even more so, he's speaking very directly to the army. So men and ladies, about 10% of the people associated with the army would have been women, who have suffered, who have gone hungry, who have gone without adequate clothing. He's appealing to their honor. He's appealing to their self-interest and self-identity. Give just a little bit more. This is successful, aided by some judicious return of back pay, because the soldiers were not adequately paid either. The army sticks together. But we're still in a very desperate position. Now, we're all familiar from our history what happens next. We have this scene, Washington crossing the Delaware. If you happen to be in Pennsylvania, the inn that he stayed at is actually still there, and it's quite impressive. There's a few things wrong with our painting here. George Washington was not standing up in the boat. So the exact historics of this picture are questionable, but the spirit behind it is not. So this ragtag collection of men who were just a few days away from dissolving completely, and the revolution with it, somehow comes together and wins a victory at Trenton. And then they do it again at Princeton. So this gives a great morale boost to American soldiers, to the United States, that perhaps this war was not so unwinnable. Now, we're familiar with the course of revolution from here. We go through the victories of Saratoga and Yorktown, with the victory eventually secured in 1783. But this begs a question. What happened to Thomas Paine? Because we saw him at the beginning of 1776 with that very direct appeal for independence. We see him at the end of 1776 and his appeal to the soldiers to keep fighting. but we don't hear about him again after December of 1776. So where did he go? In part, he works with Congress, so he has an appointment there for a period of time. By the time we get to 1781, he is headed over to France. So the Lorraine expedition. Now, the war, as we know, the United States wins, but it doesn't mean that it was easy sailing from 1777 to 1781. And one of the real deficiencies of the United States effort was a lack of money. So Lawrence, a representative from Congress, takes Paine with him to France. And essentially what they are asking for is a loan. Will the French crown, who are our allies by this point, give money to the United States to help sustain the army through another campaign? They agree to do that. Now, his role here is kind of interesting. He is not a formal ambassador. He is part of the negotiating team, but he runs into certain, shall we call them, interpersonal problems. He was a relatively prickly character to some degree. He rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and he made himself a number of political enemies, not just in France, but with the rest of the American delegation in Paris as well. Fortunately, this does not have any ill effects, but perhaps we're starting to understand why his name starts to be nudged out of our picture here. Because we've heard of Lawrence to a degree, but if we're thinking of politics, of American representation in France, we're thinking Franklin. Now, that very charismatic figure who just about everybody, and perhaps their wives and their daughters, and allegedly others, happen to like. From here, we go through a bit of a down period. So what do you do after a revolution? So Paine, being a man of the Enlightenment, has a number of ideas. He starts to work on ideas around building bridges out of iron. He's still writing politically, but he finds himself somewhat adrift after the revolution. By 1790, he finds himself in France on a visit. So part of what had come out of his revolutionary era activities there was that he did make some friends. He's still a very prolific writer, and our date here is very important. So 1790. So we are starting right on the cusp of the French Revolution. Part of what we need to do here is to forget what we know about the French Revolution for a moment. If it's 1789, 1790, we are looking at a revolution that looks very similar to the American, where we have coalitions of people who are coming together, very philosophically questioning structures of power, that be the crown, the nobility, the established church. Things go a little bit awry after that, to say the very least. Paine, in the midst of this, starts to see the nature of revolution change. So if our symbol of the American Revolution is the committee handing a document of independence over to Congress, this tends to be the picture of the French Revolution. So this comes from the very famous March of the Women on Versailles. You notice there's a few more weapons hanging around here than there was in our earlier picture. But this is a different type of revolution, something that is much more bottom up, of people who have long held grievances and also very material problems associated with food, with poverty, with almost literal starvation and inflation, who are starting to take the problems and their solutions in their own hands. Well, where does a Thomas Paine figure fit into this? Well, he is actually elected to the National Assembly. The fact that he did not speak French was not held against him, because he had the ideas that many of the more liberal nobles, more liberal clergy, now the middle classes that were leading this revolution very much was able to attach onto. So he's there, 1792. He had gone back to England for a short period of time, where he was about to be put on trial for seditious libel. So as you might imagine, this French Revolution thing is not quite as popular in England. So how do you get busted for seditious libel? You start publishing again. So in this particular case, a pamphlet called The Rights of Man. So The Rights of Man were a response to another writer by the name of Edmund Burke. So Edmund Burke was a very classically conservative British politician who saw the revolution as absolutely a horrific thing. That change was happening too fast. It was happening through the wrong people. And what was happening was anarchy. Without order, according to Burke, there could not be liberty. There could not be justice without law, and there could not be law without structure. So if society had to change, it had to change very slowly, along clear, recognizable, and most importantly, legal lines. Essentially, rights are a top-down proposition. Rights are extended to people. They are not naturally belonging to each person, and which then in turn enables government and structure. Thomas Paine absolutely attacks that idea. He sees that as the voice of wealth, of privilege, of structure, of superstition, of the influence of a crown, of a church, of a hierarchy, of a nobility that had absolutely no basis in power whatsoever that was based on any reasonable lines. So think of how many times you've said, well, why is that person in charge? That's what he's doing in written form. Now, in 1790, 1791, that is not a question that you want to be asking if you're in England. They see this French Revolution thing, and their mind jumps directly towards this could happen here. Now, you would suspect that you would get a lot of support from the United States at a time like this. And at least up to this far, Paine does have a lot of fans and admirers in the United States. They see at least this very early stage of the American Revolution as a continuation of the American Revolution. The ideas of reason, of public participation, ideas of classic liberalism, this is something that can be supported. Paine's writings not only go through England, he has to send a lot of copies because they were actually burned by the public hangman. They also are sent to the United States. So 1791, the Constitution has just been passed. We just have the Bill of Rights put into place. And he is speaking a language that is very well understood, of supporting something like an American Revolution, of supporting change without supporting demolishing the structure and starting over. The English, just because I love old woodcuts, this comes out in the paper. So you have Mad Tom, the Man of Rights, a little bit more of an interesting one on the right. This is how the British press is envisioning Thomas Paine as a man who is dangerously unstable and is preaching a doctrine of revolution that has gone way too far. Americans do not necessarily agree with this just yet. Let's keep in mind in our story, we're here right in 1791. Then, as we're all familiar with, the French Revolution takes a turn. And you start to see scenes like this. So this is the bulk of the French nobility being tossed in jail on really no other charge than being French nobility. Remember, Paine is part of the National Assembly at this time, so he is in the French government as this is going on. Paine is associated with shall we say, a more liberal faction of the revolutionaries. So a group called the Gironde, which, as revolutionaries go, were pretty moderate. Their goal was to bring reason to France. So a constitutional monarchy, a constitutional government, a rule of law rather than of person. Taken all together, that is an almost functional type of government. Unfortunately, the times did not allow for that to develop. Because think of the United States. War breaks out in April of 1775. Declaration of Independence doesn't come around until July of 1776. France did not have the benefit of that time. And as events progressed, more and more radical groups of people and more radical leaders start to come into power. So by the time we get to about September of 1792, we have scenes like this. Now, if you were just in prison, you were actually doing okay. By September of 1792 is when we start to see mass executions. So thousands, as time progresses, tens of thousands of people slaughtered based on what charge? Well, that's really unclear. That structure of legality that had existed had been swept away. And what remains is a constitution in theory. But what really comes down to is the role of the Committee of Public Safety, especially Robespierre. Now, we know his reputation. It's well-founded. He had a very specific idea of what revolution looked like. It's not what he actually ended up with. But the difference between Robespierre and the leaders we saw in the French Revolution prior to that, rather than Paine, rather than the Americans, was that he was going to support the revolution and by absolutely any means necessary. So if that meant show trials and mass executions, if that's what it took to support the revolution, that was what he was willing to do. This culminates with the execution of King Louis XVI. So we get to early 1793. Thomas Paine, remember, is still in government, and he voted against the execution of the king. He saw it as enough that they had been removed because that was the unreasonable part, was not that there was a king, but that the king had any power. Well, as you might imagine, this does not engender him very many fans. You might want to plug in your scene. Oh, I did plug in mine. Don't you just love technology? Okay, so this. Let's go search that one. You guys. Yeah, I hope so. If we start getting a whole bunch of Zoom links saying that the power went out, we'll never see them. On the subject of lights out, here's a guillotine. This becomes a scene throughout France. The king being the most famous, but the guillotine as a symbol of not only power, but of a very narrow sense of justice and of reason. Paine, being an opponent of Robespierre and belonging to another faction, he finds himself in prison. December 1793, he is arrested and he goes straight to jail. Well, being tossed in jail, having the personal enmity of Robespierre, his execution is probable. Legend says that the mark of being executed was that on the outside of your cell door, they would put a chalk mark. Legend says that they put the mark for Paine's cell on the inside of the door, so the executioner never saw it. So whether that's true or whether that story is unclear, somehow or another, he manages to stay alive. As events ensue through 1794, Robespierre and the Reign of Terror becomes more and more desperate. until such time as Robespierre himself is overthrown and executed as being entirely unreasonable. But that does not mean that 1794 is not a very interesting year, because we see scenes like this. In France, one of the primary bases of traditional power was the church. And this was something that the revolutionaries were very firmly against. So what they do is start to repurpose church buildings. Notre Dame, for example, was turned into a horse stall for a number of years, and religious processions and religious celebration was replaced with things like this. So this is the party in honor of the supreme deity, undefined. The guy up in the chair is Robespierre. So you have this very interesting connection between revolutionary government, this cult of reason, as they started to call it, and ideas of public identification. So it's national, but it's a religion that is explicitly not a religion. It recognizes some sort of deity, but there's no doctrine, there are no priests, there are no churches. There is rather scenes like this. So fête, literally party or celebration. So religion, as one of those traditional sources of power, has now been eliminated by the French Revolutionary government. So what does Paine think about all this? Because he's got a lot of time on his hands, and he's in jail, and he publishes another pamphlet, this one called The Age of Reason. If we look at exact doctrine, he has a very deistical viewpoint, and we'll get into some of the particulars here in a second. But he, in somewhat commonality with Robespierre and people of his ilk, take a look at the established church and see it as irrational and unreasonable. The power that the church had, whether that be in terms of spiritual matters or in temporal matters, so land ownership or anything else like that, was absolutely illegitimate. Now, this is very, very, to say the least, controversial. For people at the time to question yet another one of the pillars of social order was just not a theological question. It was rather a very social question. Because what holds society together if there is no king, there is no church, we have this sort of bubbling idea of nationalism, which we haven't quite defined yet. So what holds all this together? What makes people treat people in a good way? What holds society together? Well, these are very serious questions, but the responses are split. There are people who look at Paine's writing and see a very significant theological problem. So our other pamphlet here, Joseph Priestley, so Unitarianism, if you're familiar with the name, he had some, let's say, skepticism about the nature of Christ, about some theological questions, which is nothing new. But even Priestley comes out and starts to attack Paine because what he put in the Age of Reason was just way too far. So what is he saying? So here's the critique. The critique is that there is no such thing as religion. It is, by its nature, not a community event. It is not a community function. It is not something that ties community together. The only thing that makes a church is force or coercion. Basically, religion has been forced on people from the top down in order to keep them in line. He believed very strongly that the only people who could say that they've had a religious experience are those that have seen and talked to God themselves. Well, by extension, that means the scripture is illegitimate. Now, this in a theological conversation in the context of the late 18th century, that is a place where most people would fear to tread. Certainly, there had been long and very detailed and passionate arguments over theological questions like the nature of Christ, the nature of the scripture, and other things. But this is something new. Paine has gone to a place where everybody else had stopped. Moving on, Christ is not divine. Why? Because you only have a very small handful of witnesses, and their testimony cannot be trusted. That leads us back to the scripture problem. So, by the time he gets through the Age of Reason, essentially all he has distilled religion down to is, I believe in God. Well, you see the problems that come out of this, both politically and theologically. So, how do people in the States take this? Here is some of the responses. Peter Porcupine, he is a newspaper writer. Yep, he's a newspaper writer out of Philadelphia. His paper is the most widely circulated in the entire country. He does lean a little conservative. If you're a fan of British history, his actual name was William Cobbett, and he's the one responsible for making sure that Parliament actually publishes their paper for the public. So he's not a complete conservative. But this is his thoughts. So Benjamin Rush, a very well-known doctor in Philadelphia and very well-known operator in the Democratic Republican political party. So those that were coming around Jefferson, a little to the left of center. It was considered so offensive that he didn't even want to talk to the guy. So remember, Rush would have been somebody that Paine would have known socially through his connections to Philadelphia, through the Revolution. So somebody who was at least known to him, perhaps a friend, says, I don't even want to talk to the guy. So stagecoach driver, who was a bit more direct, wouldn't even give him a ride if he showed up. And then the Baltimore Republican, the most subtle of newspapers, a lily-livered cynical rogue, a giblet-inheriting slave, not but a composition of a knave, beggar, coward, panderer, and son and heir of some drunken she-devil. Which, in terms of the late 18th century publications, that is just about as strong of language as you would ever expect to see. But notice who they're talking about. Thomas Paine, a guy some 15 years earlier who was the best published pamphleteer in the entire country. The guy who wrote The Crisis, the guy who wrote the Common Sense. Now he can't even get a stagecoach ride. The people who knew him want nothing to do with him, and he is seen as a dangerous man. What came out of the French Revolution was a fundamentally different idea of what revolution looked like. As we take a look at the 1790s politics, what was acceptable to the bulk of Americans, 1776, of course, we're on board with that. But what came out of the French Revolution that had Paine's name on it was not only politically complicated, to say the least, but now is looking at revolution in a very ideological way that most people are not comfortable with. So attacking order, attacking stability, attacking those things that perhaps a Burke or a Washington or a Federalist would have supported, that was just too far. This gets wound into the politics of the 1790s as well. So we see things like this pop up in the newspapers. So on our left, George Washington. And if you look at what's propping up his picture, so law, religion, order. Over on Jefferson's side, it's a little bit harder to read, but it says Voltaire. And if you look a little bit up, Thomas Paine. So this was a very political newspaper that associated Thomas Paine with every excess of the French Revolution. So the trials, the executions, the destruction of public order, the destruction of public structure, was all laid at his feet. Now, Jefferson and Paine did know each other. They had a correspondence. Jefferson consciously tries to distance himself. Going into the 1800 election, one of the charges levied against Jefferson was that he was an atheist. And part of the proof was his affiliation or knowledge of Thomas Paine. Jefferson, of course, said, no, I know the guy, but no, no, that guy is over there. I've met him. We're not friends. The contrast here between liberty, order, structure, and unreason, the lack of structure, a revolution gone too far. It's a very clear choice that is being put forward in this political ad. As we know, Jefferson does win. So 1800, he's elected. 1802, Thomas Paine finally comes home. Now, why is he leaving France? Frankly, nobody wants the guy around. So he's been associated with the American Revolution. He's been associated with the French Revolution. The Directory that comes to power in 1795, he's not officially arrested, but the cops are keeping an eye on him. Napoleon really doesn't want the guy around either. Now, look at the trouble his pen potentially causes. And imagine what Paine would say about Napoleon, because there's more connections between a monarchy and Napoleon, even in 1798-99, than you would think. So eventually, they decide, you need to go home. Why not go to England? Well, he would have been hung. They were still looking for him for seditious libel. He lands into the United States, almost unrecognized. He does eventually visit with President Jefferson at the White House, but Jefferson really has no political use for him. Essentially, he had an old friend from the Revolution over for dinner, and he was sent on his way. Eventually, he settles in a place that was granted to him by the New York government back in the 1770s or 80s in New Rochelle, where he retires with a French lady that he had acquaintance with and a couple of children. 1809, he dies. Now, after his death, you would normally expect that rule about not speaking ill of the dead to take place. Here's what the newspaper had to say. A total of 6 people show up to his funeral, one of which was the coffin maker, who was trying to get paid. There was no real official notice. So he dies in obscurity. So Jefferson, going back to 1776, he's nowhere to be found. Monroe, who had been his friend over in Paris and had actually helped get him out of jail back in the 1790s, he's nowhere to be found. His fall from grace is almost complete, from being one of the most widely known, widely supported, best-selling author to essentially a pauper's grave. Well, this brings up another question for us. And this is not just of the history, but of historical memory. When we started, we all recognized Paine from his 1776 writings. There is very little notice of what he had done since, or even that he had passed on. Part of his ideas were so radical that they did not fit in very well, at least not in the early 1800s. He does go to historical rehab over the course of time. Some of his ideas were ahead of their time, things like the abolition of slavery, direct democracy, and some others that are adopted along the way. But he still never really comes out of the shadow that is cast by that second part of his career. Eventually, they do put up a monument to him. So this is his gravesite in New York. And that is what is written on it and how he is to be remembered. So notice what is conspicuously missing from this picture of his life. Anything past 1776 has no mention, even on his gravestone. So what does this tell us? Part of the difficulty of evaluating his character is that he had such this just absolute tremendous fall from grace as one of those Revolutionary era fathers that we look back on some 250 years later. His later career essentially has wiped out his memory past 1776. So think of the monuments that we see. Think of the stories that we are telling here in 2026 and notice what's left out of most of them. There is another irony here, and we'll finish off with this. They're not even sure his body's there. His body was apparently exhumed, according to legend, at one point in time, and the parts scattered all over. There was a legend that part of it even ended up in the hands of William Cobbett, of all people. So remember his critic from 10 years prior? So as we look at this gravestone, we look at the limitations of what the plaque says, we're not even sure that the body's there, which perhaps is the greatest obscurity of them all. Thank you. Okay, so we do have some time for any questions that you might have. Yeah, go for it.
The studying part of the religious side, that means you're at it's sort of planned. You sort of looked at that as the late 1800s, 1920s, sort of another period and stuff. And you planned that when his ideas start, because there must have been a period where they weren't being studied and celebrated, and then this is 1952, so Martha was put in, was it earlier?
Okay, so the question is, when did he start to come back into our historical story? To a certain degree, I would argue that post 1776, his career never really did come back in the full measure. We do see some elements of his writings that become more popular in the lead up to the Civil War, particularly what he had to say about the abolition of slavery. Some of his writings become more popular as we get into the 1940s and 50s. So very much that talk against superstition, against totalitarianism, against those ideas that we are seeing coming out of communism and fascism. But some of his later writings really remain in the domain of academics rather than the popular history. So many of us in school read at least portions of The Crisis or of Common Sense. It's a rare person that has read Age of Reason. Yes.
Yeah, congratulations. This is an incredible presentation. Question, is there any documented correspondence between Maine and Washington, particularly with regard to the 1776 period? So I kind of have the sense that had there been a French George Washington, perhaps the French Revolution might not have turned the way that it did into total anarchy. I mean, Washington is really credited with holding the country together during those difficult times. So I'm just wondering if there's any evidence or relationship between Paine and Washington.
Okay, so the question is there a relationship between Washington and Paine? Certainly they knew each other. They ran in somewhat similar circles, and certainly there was correspondence between them. Washington, remember, is a little bit older. He's a little bit more conservative. Him and Paine had some clashes, particularly after he goes to France. And some of the things that Paine gets wrapped up in as part of the French Revolution are really opposed by Washington and people of his nature. After he's arrested, Washington, who is president by this time, really doesn't do a whole lot even to get him out of jail. So, out of sight, out of mind. It's really Monroe, who was the ambassador at the time, that put some effort into getting him out of lockup. But Washington was just not interested by the time we get to the 1790s. Just let me check, see if there's anything going online. Doesn't look like anything in the chat, so. Any other questions? All right, well, go right on ahead.
Is this something, I hear this after a lot of these kind of talks. Is this something? Is this in a book? Are you gonna write a book or?
Well, yes and no.
That's the same answer everyone else gives.
It is actually published because this is part of a chapter out of my master's thesis.
Oh, excellent.
So yes, it exists. No, it's not going to be a book. It's one of those things that lives on my computer and I look at every couple of years when I'm looking for ideas.
Is this something we can find? Because there's so much information that it's like.
Yeah, I can send you the chapter,
Hey,
or if you really want to punish yourself, I can send you the whole thesis, which is also available online. Now, if you read through the whole thing, you'll be the first person since about 2008 when
set it as a goal this winter. I'll get the chapter of Sunday.
Do we know who Paine credits with influencing him?
Okay, so do we know who Paine credits with influencing him? So part of this is that Paine is part of a community that are asking questions like this. So the Enlightenment political scene, we're familiar with, Rousseau and Voltaire and Burke and, John Locke, figures like that. So part of this is the conversation that gentlemen, philosophers, clerics, those people would have been having. So his influences are many. He is part of that political community. There was a number of critics of royal power in the 1950s or 1750s and 60s, which he is tapped into. So people that would have been around, say, William Pitt and some of those figures. The difference with him is that he wrote to the middle class or the lower middle class. So he wrote to the popular audience in a way that you didn't have to be a philosopher or a theologian to follow what he was saying. And that is part of what made him dangerous in many eyes, was that he wrote in a way that everybody could understand. So what is he saying that's completely new? Not a whole lot. Some of his ideas, when we get to Age of Reason, are new, but that's building off of other things that we had seen in the Enlightenment. It's his presentation that makes it so significant. And so how did I decide to do my master's thesis on Thomas Paine? So this is one chapter of 5 or 6, and the thesis is actually on religion and public order. And this is one of those great debates that we see in the newspapers of the time and the politics of the time of how can public order be maintained with no type of agreed upon moral or religious basis. So I go on to talk about the election of 1800 and some of the back and forth there. And then a little bit earlier, I take a good look at the First Amendment and the non-establishment clause, where we see really not the same types of debates, surprisingly enough. So the idea of religion and public order is something that really comes to the forefront around 1793, 94, more so than when we were debating the Bill of Rights themselves. Which, if there's interest in that, I can throw together a talk on that pretty shamelessly. But anything else? It looks like we're still clear online.
Where
Okay.
is this? Where is this monument?
So that's New Rochelle, New York. Where is the monument? New Rochelle, what had been his home there.
What's John Adams' name?
Yep, because that is what he is said to have said. So if I can,
Oh,
yeah, so if we, so that is what John Adams was quoted as to have said about Paine. Yep. Oh, no worries. Because it is very interesting that they bring in John Adams for a quote.
yeah.
And we do have records of some correspondence between them in the early 1800s, where they really try to, hash out some of what Paine had meant in the Age of Reason, to some success, I suppose.
All right, if there's no more questions, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much. And again, if you're interested in religion and politics and culture, go to our talk on Friday night at the Hidden Barn Books, because that's what we'll be talking about. Thank you very, very much.